Welcome back to another crochet tutorial with Cozy Rosie UK, and today I am sharing with you how to crochet the Souffle Puffy Beret. Now this beret uses the puff stitch to create a highly textured beret with a beautifully ribbed brim, and I've used it in a variegated yarn, so self-striping, whatever you want to call it, because it just means I don't have to change colours myself. Ultimately, I'm a little bit lazy when it comes to colour changing, hate weaving in ends, so I think when there are yarns this beautiful out there, why should we bother? So I'm going to be using this James C. Brett marble. As you can see, it has loads of different colour variations throughout it and works up absolutely beautifully. This is marked as a chunky weight, so it's James C. Brett marble in chunky. And for the adult sized hat that this pattern is written for, you're going to need 170 meters of this chunky or bulky weight yarn. Now, hook size wise, I'm going to be using a 6mm hook. This is a Furls Streamline resin, a lovely glittery one, because I thought it matched the yarn quite well. So, of course, you're going to need a pair of scissors and a darning needle to weave in these ends, unlike I have successfully done here. But of course, you can opt to add a little pom-pom on as well to use up whatever yarn is left on the ball. So gather all your materials and let's get started. And this beret is started by working the ribbing first. The ribbing is worked in rows to create a strip of ribbing which is going to be seamed. We then work the top of the beret onto the band of ribbing that we create. So we start by making our brim with our slip knot on our hook. We begin by making a chain of 7. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. We are then going to work 1 US single crochet into the second chain and each across. So this loop doesn't count. There's our first chain. We're going in underneath the top loop of our second, yarn over, bring a loop up, yarn over, pull through 2. We have to ignore that nice big hole and go into the next chain to work our second single crochet. Work our third, fourth, there's number 5, and number 6. So once we've finished row 1, you should have a stitch count of 6 single crochets. So for row 2, we begin with a chain of 1. We then turn our work. We begin by making 1 single crochet into the same stitch as our chain 1, because our chain 1 does not count as a stitch, and we're just working a single crochet. We're then going to work into the back loop of our stitches. So normally we go underneath our stitch to pick up both loops, but we're going to be working a ribbing. So we just insert our hook through the middle of our stitch to pick up the back loop only to work our single crochet. We're doing this into the next 4 stitches. So that was number 1. Number 2 is worked into the back loop only, as is number 3, 4, 4, and 5. And then to keep our brim really neat, we work under both loops of our stitch for the final stitch. So you should maintain your stitch count of 6 single crochets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and the middle 4 are worked into the back loop only. So for rows 3 to 56, we're going to repeat row 2. So we chain 1, work 1 single crochet into the same stitch as our chain 1, before working 1 single crochet into the back loop only of those next 4 stitches. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then into our final stitch, we work under both loops, picking up both loops of our stitch to work that final double crochet. So repeat row 2 until you have a total row count of 56, and I will meet you back to join our brim, and then we can continue on to make the top of our beret. Just before I leave you to go off and make your brim, I clearly have already made mine here. I wanted to show you how to count your rows and make it really easy. So you can see that you've got what look like pairs, depending on which way it's facing. So depending on which way you're counting, you can either count the dips. This is the right side. So I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. Now, something I want to also mention is you may grab your tape measure and give this finished brim a measure and think, well, that's never going to fit my head. But if I give it quite a stretch, you'll see that it increases dramatically in size. And when we work the first round, you will see that it does increase quite dramatically, because this section, we know that crochet stretches, but this will stretch quite a lot. And if we start off with it being the right size, it'll be too big to wear once you've worn it once. So it is designed, this brim is designed to be a little bit tight when we're making, so that it's comfortable but not too loose when we're wearing this beret. So go ahead and work your 56 rows, and then I'll meet you so that we can join our brim. It does look tiny, but I promise you it really does stretch. So go ahead and make your rows, and I'll meet you to join them together in a moment. So once you've worked all 56 rows, what we need to do is to join these two ends together to create the brim of our hat. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to make a chain of 1. We're going to bring the edges together, and we're going to work back through each stitch and the corresponding wrong side of our beginning chain. So we're still working in the same direction, but we're just going to slip stitch them together. So we insert our hook through the first stitch and through that first stitch, making sure that our brim isn't twisted. Just yarn over, pull through, and straight through the loop on your hook. And we're going to work this through each of the 6 stitches. This is number 2. 3. 4. 5. And of course, finally, number 6. Bring that loop up so we can see, and it just gives us a bit of a seam on one side, but it's practically invisible on the other. So we're just going to flip that so that the seam is on the inside, and then that becomes the in. This then becomes the right side of our brim. You'll have both ends here. So once you've flipped it, make sure you don't trap your yarn. I flipped mine the wrong way. There we go. Make sure that your yarn is on the outside here, and then we're just going to reinsert our hooks, and we are ready to proceed to working across the ends of our rows. So our hat is going to build up from here. So we're going to start round 1 of our hat with a chain 1, and we're going to be working 1 single crochet into the end of each row. So for each row here, you can see we've got this first one here, so we just insert our hook and work 1 single crochet, and that's for this first row here. And that rib row, you can see there's a nice big hole to work into, so that's number 2. We have to be very careful we don't increase whilst we're doing this, so you make sure that you work into the end of each row, making sure that for each kind of dip and rib there's only 1 stitch, and we're aiming to work 1 single crochet into the end of each row. We know that we have 56 rows, so we're looking to have a stitch count of 56 at the end of round 1. So continue to work into the end of each row where your stitch count should be 56, and I'll meet you back for round 2. So at the end of round 1, you should have 1 single crochet into the end of each row, and we need to join to the first single crochet that we made, which is actually that one. I made that very small. So we're going to just insert our hook and slip stitch to join. You should still have a stitch count of 56 single crochets at the end of round 1. And you'll have, I've woven my end in as I've gone, and we are ready to go into round 2. So going into round 2 of our hat, we're going to start by making a chain of 1. This chain 1 does not count as a stitch, and then we're going to work a puff stitch into the same stitch that we made our slip stitch into. So the puff stitch is worked by yarning over and inserting into the same stitch, and we're going to be making a yarn over pull through 4 times. So we're going to yarn over ready for the first time, insert, bring a loop up, and you want this to be quite loose because we're going to have to pull through all the loops on our hook. So that was the first time. I'm going to yarn over a second, bring up another few loops. This is for the 3rd time and for the 4th time, all into that same stitch. Now you should have 9 loops on your hook. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. We're then going to yarn over and pull through all 9 loops. I gently pull down and with my project and up with my hook to pull through all 9 loops. Now this puff stitch is then closed with a chain of 1, and to create lots of space and openness in this pattern, we're then going to work an additional chain 1. It should look nice and puffy. You've got your chain 1 to close the stitch and an extra chain 1. We're then going to skip the next stitch, so we're not working into this one, we're going to be working into the next, and we're making another puff stitch. So we yarn over, we're skipping 1, working into the next, and we're repeating the same puff stitch, so we yarn over and bring a loop up 4 times. So that's 1, yarn over, insert for a 2nd time, yarn over, bring a loop up for the 3rd, and then finally for the 4th. So we should have 9 loops on our hook before we yarn over and pull through all 9 loops. I have to help that last one over, and then we close the puff stitch with a chain 1, and then we're making an extra chain 1 just to create lots of space in our hat. We're going to repeat that for a 2nd time. So we skip 1, and then we're going to repeat that, working another puff stitch into the next. So skip 1, puff stitch into the next. That's 1, 2, 3 and 4. If you're finding your loops are really tight, it's really worth exaggerating your movements so that when you yarn over and pull through all 9 loops, it's quite a smooth process. Just going to yarn over and complete that stitch with our chain 1, and then chain 1 again as an extra to create lots of lovely space. So we currently have 3 puff stitch, each with a chain 1 space in between. We've got our chain 1 that closed the previous puff and our chain 1. We're going to skip the next stitch, and then we're going to work our puff stitch into the next. So we yarn over, bring up a loop 4 times and 4. So we've got those 9 loops. Pull through all 9 loops, close with your chain 1 and work an extra chain 1. The next stitch is going to be worked right next to the current puff stitch, so we're not skipping this time. So we're yarning over and puffing into the next stitch. So we work our puff stitch, that's 2, 3 and 4. Pull through all 9, close with our chain 1 and chain 1. So once we've worked these first 5 puff stitches, we're going to start the pattern repeat that's repeated around the rest of the brim. So we're going to work into the stitch next to that last puff worked after we've done that chain 2, placing our next puff stitch. 1, 2, 3 and 4. Pull through all 9 and close with your chain 1, work your extra chain 1, and then we're going to skip the next, and we're going to do that 3 times. So this is the 2nd time, so 1, 2, 3 and 4, pull through, chain 1, extra chain 1, that's the 2nd time. We skip 1, work our puff stitch, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, pull through all 9, chain one, work your extra chain one and skip the next. So we've done that 3 times. So we're going to skip the next, and then we're working 1 puff stitch, 2, 3, 4, pull through. We'll make that a bit tight. Chain 1 to close and your extra chain 1, and we're puff stitching into the next, so right next to the last one that we've worked. 3 and 4. Oops. Pull through, chain 1, work your extra chain 1, and that is the repeat. So we finished there, and this is where we started, where they're next to each other. So it should look like you have 3 puff stitches in a row, 3 with a space in between, and then we start our repeat again to work that 3rd one next to it. So we're going to be working around, so this is where our repeat started. So we work puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1 3 times. So that's 1, 2, 3, chain 1, skip 1, and then we're working puff stitch, chain 1, puff stitch, chain 1, plus into the stitch next to each other. So there's no skip in between the last pair. We then start our repeat again in that next stitch, working 1 puff stitch, you close with a chain 1 and work that additional chain 1 and skip 1 3 times. So that was 1, so we puff stitch, chain 1 to close, chain 1, skip 1 for the 2nd time, then we puff stitch, pull through, chain 1 to close, chain 1 and skip 1 for the 3rd time. So that's the first part. So we've done puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1, puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1, puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1, it's just underneath there, and then we work puff stitch, chain 1, puff stitch, chain 1 without that skip in between. Chain 1, we're not skipping this time, we're working into that next stitch, working the chain 1 to close, chain 1, and then we restart the repeat again. So we puff stitch into the next, chain 1, skip 1, puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1, puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1, etc. And it will look like you end up with 3 puff stitches together, followed by 3 puff stitches with spaces in between. Depends which way your brain works as to how you calculate that. And you're going to repeat that the whole way around, all the way to that last stitch. Where is that going to be? All the way around here, and that's where I'm going to meet you. So continue to repeat that around, working puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1 3 times, followed by puff stitch, chain 1, don't skip, twice. So continue to repeat that around for the remainder of row 1, and I'll meet you at the end ready to join and continue on to round 3. So once you've repeated that around, you should have those groups of 3 with those 3 opens in between, and you should end with your 2 puff stitches together, and then we are ready to slip stitch to join to the top of that first puff stitch that we made, and we're joining into the chain 1 just above that first puff stitch. We're just slip stitching into there, and you should have a total of 35 puff stitches. 35. Phew, I thought I had an extra one there. So you should have 35 puff stitches, which of course will give you 35 chain 1 spaces as well. So rounds 3 to 6 are a lot simpler. There's no increasing in them. We simply begin by slip stitching into the chain 1 space that we created, and then we make our chain 1, and we're ready to very simply work 1 puff stitch into each chain 1 space around. So we're doing the same puff stitch, so we yarn over, insert and bring our loop up 4 times. I only did 3. 4 times. We're going to yarn over, pull through all 9 loops hopefully. There we go. And make our chain 1 to close and work our chain 1 again. And we're just going to work 1 puff stitch, which is closed with a chain 1, with that extra chain 1 after, all the way around. So we're simply placing 1 puff stitch, which is closed with a chain 1, and then we're working that extra chain 1 into each of the spaces in between these puff stitches around. So the number of puff stitches isn't going to change. They're going to maintain that count of 35 puff stitches for each of these rounds, and we're repeating this for rounds 3, 4, 5 and 6. And this is going to create the bulk of our hat or our beret. One more. The main thing is to make sure you're making your puffs the right size. So we are simply working 1 puff stitch into each chain 1 space around, and you'll find that your hat will get wider. It'll end up about here by the time you've worked all of those rounds, which is exactly what we want. And after round 6, we're going to start coming back in to close the top of our beret, should I say. Continue on to work rounds 3 to 6, and I'll meet you back at the end of round 6. Each round is going to be joined into that chain 1 of your first puff stitch of the round. We slip stitch in to that first chain 2 space and continue around. So we're working rounds 3, 4, 5 and 6, and I'll meet you back to continue on to round 7, where we start decreasing to bring in the top of our beret. I'll see you shortly once you've completed those 4 rounds. So once you've completed all 6 rounds, working 1 puff stitch into each, I shouldn't do that chain 1 yet, that's cheating. And they've joined. When you lay it flat, it should be starting to curl in, which is exactly what we want it to do, because we haven't been increasing, so that we are ready to bring in the top of our hat. So going into round 7, we slip stitch into that next chain 1 space, and in this round we're going to start decreasing. We're going to start with our chain of 1. We're going to puff stitch into this same chain 1 space, make our chain 1 to close and make our chain 1. We're then going to work 1 puff stitch with our chain 1 into each of the next 4 spaces. So 1, that's number 3, and number 4. So at this point we should have 5 puff stitches, but we started here working 1 puff stitch into each of the next 4. And we are then going to work our puff stitch 2 together across the next 2 spaces. So I've yarned over ready, and essentially we're working our puff stitch without pulling through all of them in the first part. So we yarn over and bring up a loop 4 times. And 4, and this time we're only going to pull through the first 8 loops, so we leave that last loop on our hook. So we yarn over, pull through the first 8 loops, leaving that last loop on our hook. We're then going to work the first part of our puff stitch into the next chain 1 space, so we yarn over, bring up a loop 4 times, and 4, yarn over, pull through those first 8 loops again, and now we have 3 loops on our hook. We're going to yarn over, pull through those 3 loops and close with our chain 1 before adding our extra chain 1, and that reduces those 2 chain 1 spaces into 1. We're going to repeat this around, working 1 puff stitch into each of the next 4 before working our puff stitch 2 together across the next 2. So work 1 puff stitch with your chain 1 into each of the next 4, and I'll meet you for our next decrease. So once you've worked 1 puff stitch into each of the next 4 after your decrease, we're going to work our next puff stitch 2 together across these next 2 spaces. So we yarn over and bring up a loop 4 times, 3 and 4, just as before, and we're going to pull through the first 8 loops, leaving that loop on our hook. We then go into the next chain 1 space, yarning over and pulling up 4 times. We're going to yarn over, leave those 2, pull through those 8. Oh, she says, there we go. And then we yarn over, pull through those 3 loops before making our chain 1 to close, and we're making our extra chain 1. So we're going to repeat this all the way around, working 1 puff stitch into each of the next 4 before working our puff stitch 2 together. And when you work around, you'll have 4 chain 1 spaces remaining where we just work 1 puff stitch into each. So we're decreasing 5 times in this round. So continue working that around, working 1 puff stitch into each of the next 4 with that extra chain 1 in between, and then work your decrease over the next 2. In those last 4 chain 1 spaces, you'll just be working 1 puff stitch into each, 1 puff stitch into each, and I'll meet you ready to join the round. So once you've worked all the way round, you should end working 1 puff stitch into each of the next 4, or the last 4, and we're going to slip stitch to join to the top of that first puff stitch that we made. At the end of round 7, you should have 25 puff stitches and 5 puff stitch 2 togethers. Now it's important to note that this space in between your decrease is not a chain 1 space, and that's going to become really important as we continue to decrease, because it's going to be very tempting to work into that space, and we must ignore it, working into those larger spaces either side. Going into round 8, we're going to start by slip stitching into that next chain 1 space before making our chain of 1. We're working a puff stitch into that first chain 1 space, close with our chain 1, make that chain 1, and then we're going to work 1 puff stitch and our chain 1 into the next 2 spaces. That's 1, and then number 2, we're then going to work our decrease across the next 2. So we yarn over and work the first half of our puff stitch before yarning over, pulling through the first 8 loops. Repeat the other half of our puff stitch, pull through the first 8 loops. I don't think I have 8 there. 2, 3, 4. Oh, I have. Before pulling through all 3 and making our chain 1. This is where we have to skip that space. This is our next chain 1 space. So it seems quite far away, but that is in the middle. That's, yeah, we're just not working in there at all. So we're going to continue to repeat working our puff stitch 2 together, and then working 1 puff stitch into each of the next 2 spaces. So we've done our puff stitch 2 together, so we're working our puff stitch into the next. So that's 1. Oh, I'm caught on something. So that's 1. So that's 1. This is a second one. 2, 3, 4. And then we're decreasing across the next 2 again. Always seems a bit trickier pulling through that next one. Pull through all 3, chain 1 to close, and chain 1. So repeating this all the way across, so working our puff stitch 2 together, and then working 1, ignore that, working 1 puff stitch into each of the next chain 1 spaces. That is not a chain 1 space, that is the top of your puff stitch 2 together. Really important that we skip those. So continue around working your puff stitch 2 together, working 1 puff stitch into each of the next chain 1 spaces, decrease across the next 2, etc. Continue that all the way around, and you'll be working 1 final puff stitch into that last chain 1 space when you get to it. So continue around, and I'll meet you for our last puff stitch of the round. I've just worked my last puff stitch decrease, and we have 1 final puff stitch to work. Oops. Into that last chain 1 space. And it should have come in quite considerably, the top of our hat on this round. And you may think, goodness, this is going against every single rule you know when it comes to increasing and decreasing. But because of the shape of the beret, it will, because we need to decrease quite severely to bring the flatter top of the beret in. So very unusual, usually, if you're this way inclined and you're quite fascinated by how things or maths works in crochet, never would I normally decrease over a previous decrease, but it does really help to bring in the beret shape. So at the end of round 8, you should have 16 puff stitches and 7 puff stitch 2 togethers, and a total of 23 chain 1 spaces. So count your puffs, count your puff togethers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and then decreases 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. As before, we're going to be joining to the top of the chain 1 of the puff stitch from the beginning of the round, just with a slip stitch, and going straight into round 9. We're going to start by slip stitching into that first chain 1 space. We're going to make our chain of 1 before we work our first puff stitch into that same chain 1 space. Need to add on that extra chain 1 at the end after we've closed it, and we are then going to start our repeat. We are then going to work our decrease, our puff stitch 2 together over the next 2 chain 2 spaces. Ooh. We are then going to work our puff stitch 2 together across the next 2 chain 1 spaces. And we were going to repeat this the whole way around, working our puff stitch into the next, followed by our puff stitch 2 together over the next 2 chain 2 spaces. So once we've worked the puff stitch into the next, we work our puff stitch 2 together across the next 2 spaces. So we're going to repeat that around until we have just 2 chain 1 spaces remaining, where we're going to be working 1 puff stitch plus that chain 1 into each. Just working my final chain 1, ready to join round 9 to the top of the puff stitch from the beginning of the round. Let's place that flat for a moment if we can. And you can really see just how much those decreases have brought in the top of that hat on this round, and why those decreases need to be so severe. So at the end of round 9, you should have 9 puff stitches and 7 puff stitch 2 together, and you should still have 16 chain 1 spaces. Going into round 10, we begin by slip stitching into that first chain 1 space. We then chain 1. We're going to start this round by working our puff stitch 2 together across the next 2 chain 1 spaces. So we're working our puff stitch 2 together. Ooh, leave that one on. And work the other half into that next chain 1 space. We are then going to work our puff stitch into the next chain 1 space. And we're going to repeat this all the way around. Work it, it's easier to flick that out of the way. So we're going to work our puff stitch 2 together across the next 2 spaces before working our puff stitch in the next. And we're going to repeat that all the way around to the last space where we work 1 final puff stitch. So continue to work your puff stitch 2 together across the next 2 chain 1 spaces before working your puff stitch and your chain 1 into the next. And I'll meet you at that last chain 1 space where we're working that extra, where we'll be working that additional puff stitch just at the end. It's getting a bit close up here in with all these decreases. So I've worked that final puff stitch in the repeat, and I'm just working a final puff stitch into that last chain 1 space. We need to join into that chain 1 at the top of our puff stitch 2 together to close round 10. I'll bring up a loop so we can have a quick count. So at the end of round 10, you should have 6 puff stitches. Move my ends out of the way. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. And then we should have 5 puff stitched together. So we have 1 right underneath where I've joined. So 1, 2, 3, 4 and number 5. We're going into round 11. We are of course going to slip stitch into that first chain 1 space and begin with our chain of 1 before we work a puff stitch into that first chain 1 space. We are then working our decrease across the next 2 spaces. Went a bit too far there. We are going to be working a puff stitch 2 together 4 more times to reach back the beginning of our round, which was this puff stitch just before here. So we've already worked the first puff stitch 2 together. We're going to do that 4 more times across the next 2 chain 1 spaces. So we'll have a total of 5 puff stitch 2 togethers. So this is number 2. Don't forget to do that extra chain 1. And then we're working across the next 2 again for number 3. And then it just feels like it's all very tight up amongst itself, isn't it now? So just take care that you're working into the right spaces. And we're decreasing across all of these spaces here. We still have these last 2 to decrease, and then that brings us back to the beginning of the round. This is the last space. There is 1 final chain 1 space there. And we are joining to the top of that first puff stitch of the round. Whew, and look how big our opening has not become. You should still have a nice circular shape for your beret. And we have this tiny opening. We have worked our final puff stitch for this project, you'll be happy to know. We've joined into the top of that first puff stitch from the previous round. We are going to very simply make a chain one. We're not slip stitching into the next chain one space for round 12. Instead, we're making a chain one, and we are working one single crochet into the same as our chain one, so into the top of that puff stitch. And then we're going to work one single crochet into each chain one space and into the top of each puff stitch 2 together around. So we have a total of 11 single crochets. So there's the top of your puff stitch 2 together, and put it into the chain one space, which is nice, and then into the top of your puff stitch. Another one into your chain one space, into the top of your puff stitch, 2 together, chain one space, top of your puff stitch, chain one space, and then we just need to work into the top of that final puff stitch, and then that final chain one space, and then we simply just need to join to that first single crochet of the round that we made, slip stitch to join. I'm going to make a little chain one to fasten off, and then fasten off with a long tail and use your hook to bring that through. And we are simply going to grab our yarn, going to grab our yarn needle, place our yarn onto our needle and use that to cinch up that remaining hole by weaving through the remaining stitches. Now I weave through just the top loops, or the ones that are the closest to the top of the hat, because this is the right side of our hat facing us. So we are just weaving through each of the stitches. I'm going through one loop of each stitch. And the reason behind that is when you cinch it, it sits so nicely. I think that might be it. And then when we pull, it closes that hole completely. Oops. And once that's cinched, it closes the hole completely, and I can just push it through the middle of the beanie of the beret, so that all that's left to do is to weave in and secure this end, and you have completed your very own puff stitch beret when it has that lovely join at the top. Thank you so much for joining me for this tutorial. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you once again, and I will see you in the next video.